I mean, you'll hear some papers here. I'll make it noise for dramatic effect. Yeah, I read an article a couple weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal with the headline, Wolf Resurgence in Washington State Tests Limits of Civility. And I don't actually, like, in rereading it after I reached out to you, I realized, like, I don't even know if they talked to you for it. I don't know if they quoted materials from you from elsewhere. But they basically just read, they wrote about your organization and the work that you do. And because of the work that I do, I think I hopped those rails instantly that I'm trying to connect with you, which is just that, you help people. My understanding is, like, you help people talk to each other in very heated, no pun intended, very heated circumstances or very combative circumstances, and you sort of help them thaw and connect and have productive dialogue. And my purview, where I write about, or where a lot of the stuff I write about is coming from, is the internet, where it feels like there is no such entity. And I started thinking about, like, what if the media served that kind of function? What if there were entities like that for civilians? Because I hear a lot of doom and gloom, and I'm skeptical that everything is flaming wreckage as much as people say, as much as that's what they hear and that's what they're picking up and that's what they're saying. But I still think it's like an interesting thought experiment to hear from someone nowadays who's making people less angry, because that doesn't seem to be the norm right now. So that's where I'm coming from.
And remind me again, what's your, is your goal to write an article on this? And are you like a freelance journalist, or like how does that, where does this go? Where does this go?
Oh, good question. I wish I knew. Basically, like, I started doing these kind of conversations 4 or 5 years ago. Nowadays, they're much more big picture, much more existential. The questions don't really have answers. But overall, the goal is to, like, cross-pollinate, like, to try to connect dots from what's seen as kind of a myopic space, video games, and to try to find, like, where it connects or where it has parallels with, like, bigger crises. So I have found, like, the best engine for trying to pitch articles or trying to do other things. I just finished writing a book as a result of this project. Just comes from me following my weird instincts, keeping an open mind, and seeing where it goes. So obviously, anything out of or off the record will be taken out, but try to present these conversations as Q&As to my audience. As sort of a more like, well, you take from it what you need or what you feel like you will, and I'm going to keep thinking, and I'm going to try to pitch. So,
and you're going to try, and so, like, I did not do any research on you. Such is the extent of my trust of you, and I don't know, something like that.
Sure.
But,
Thank you.
But like, but are you? So do you You said something about Q&As. Like, do you have like a blog that you have some default outlet that you use, and then if you can get a bigger story, you get a bigger story, or how does that work?
Exactly. No, that's it exactly. I mean, I kind of post the raw material from all these interviews. That is the goal, is to pitch and to try to place articles. But also the goal is, like, I want to learn about this stuff, and I have readers who also want to learn about this stuff, or they just also are similarly trusting and will go with me where I'm going.
All right, cool. That all sounds great.
Thank you.
Yeah,
okay.
Love it.
Okay.
Great.
Cool. So now you understand it probably better than I do.
Or just enough to be dangerous.
Exactly. So
what do you want to chat about?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of just do this as a way for people to give context on themselves out of the gate, is to just ask some very basic information and a little bit that'll sort of tee us up for the main topic at hand. But If you could just, for the recording, can you just give your first and last name, give your age, tell me where you're based out of, and then can you maybe talk a little bit about what has inspired you to kind of do conflict resolution, or like what activated you, or that became like a big passion for you?
Yes, sure. I don't really care that you know my age. I'm not one of those people, but I'm like, why does that matter? I'm 49, by the way.
I ask everybody. There are reasons to try to make the data that I'm gathering, more accessible and sort of make my project more of a resource.
Okay. Well, anyway, I don't care. You can ask me anything.
Okay.
As long as you don't mind my dog, barking in the background.
Nope.
So my name is Francine Madden. I'm the executive director of the Center for Conservation Peacebuilding. I'm 49 years old, and I live in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Was that everything?
Yeah, that's the first half. The other is just like what kind of I don't know if inspired is the right word or passion is the right word. Like how did you find yourself? Basically
how did
being
I get
involved.
Here?
Yeah, not in the existential sense, but just sort of when it comes to conflict resolution and the work that you do, how did you find yourself there?
All right. So, great question. First of all, what I do is conflict transformation, and I'll get to why that's different from conflict resolution.
Yes, I figured you would be correcting me on some of these things as we go.
Oh, David, I'm just going to be correcting you the whole way. No,
I can't wait.
But it leads into sort of what it is we do and
exactly.
And
no, I figured
why it actually works. But I got my start about close to 25 years ago. I was working in Gwindi Impenetrable National Park in southwest Uganda, and you had mountain gorillas were habituated for tourism, and then they would move out into the village, and they'd raid people's crops and sometimes attack people. And these would be like the semi-habituated males that broke off from the tourist group. Anyway, there's a little biology in there, but the point is that you had these mountain gorillas out in people's crops, eating their family's food for, the next month or so. And occasionally someone would get attacked by a single male mountain gorilla. And then when the mountain gorillas were out in the communities would be, families would be afraid to send their children to school. So schools shut down for a month on end because it's a very agricultural area, dense agricultural area, and people didn't know exactly where the mountain gorilla was. So, no one wants to send their kids to school if they think they might get attacked.
Right.
Same thing with the local health clinics. And the health clinics and schools were often built with revenue sharing money from the park. So, yay, great benefit to the community, but not really because people were, losing food and were too afraid either to go to the health clinic or send their kid to school or even take their crops to market so they could sell them and make a living. And so, I went in like, oh, cool, mountain gorilla conservation, and then realized kind of what was going on. And so what was happening is that the conservation authorities were not addressing this issue. It's kind of there was a paralysis of analysis. There was only like 650 mountain gorillas, and it was, sort of the double-edged sword of ecotourism. And it's kind of like, oh, God, what do you do about it? And not knowing how to address the issue, people sometimes or institutions can sometimes get paralyzed. So as a result, the communities would retaliate because they weren't included in decision-making. They didn't feel heard. They didn't feel, you had tourists who would come in, right, who were very, very wealthy and were spending a heck of a lot of money coming into and basically viewing the mountain gorillas in somebody's garden while the mountain gorillas are eating that family's food for the month. So communities would retaliate by poaching the mountain gorillas and then sending them over the border to the Democratic Republic of Congo for barbecue. It wasn't widespread known. I mean, people kind of knew that the poaching was going on, but it's not like it's not like people are like, hey, we're going to go poach mountain gorillas, and and then they wave a red flag and or walking across the border to sell the meat.
Right.
So you have this lose-lose situation. Oh, and the other thing that was going on was that because mountain gorillas were now going into people's crops more, and spending more time in the village, a number of people in the local communities had scabies, which is like a body lice.
Yeah.
And because mountain gorillas and people are so similar, if it's a respiratory disease or scabies or anything like that, it can very easily transfer to the mountain gorillas. So when I first got there, you had, I forget if it was like one or two people that were attacked by a mountain gorilla. You had one of the tourists, the habituated mountain gorilla groups for tourism, living out of the park essentially, or spending a heck of a lot of time out of the park raiding people's crops. They contracted scabies. The veterinarian, they tried to dart them to give them medicine, but one of the babies died. So you have this lose-lose situation, and the only way, a common phenomenon on the conservation side, whether that's government or NGO, is sort of trying to impose solutions. But if people feel that their way of life is threatened, if they don't feel like they're recognized and acknowledged, if they don't have meaningful say in decisions that affect them, they retaliate. And so you have this retaliation going on, and basically there was no process for no way to bring people together, or no understanding that building those relationships and reconciling that deeper rooted conflict, and putting in place a process that actually empowered communities to be part of that decision making. So that just didn't exist.
Yeah.
And so this conflict kept persisting and kept getting worse. So long story short, so I had actually worked with all, the communities, the government, the NGOs on the conservation and development side, and I was kind of like, hey, let's address this, let's put in place a process to address this. And I initially got mandate to do it, but I wasn't allowed to bring in the community. And I said, well, thanks, but no thanks. I don't want your money. I don't want to do this.
Right.
Because it's not going to work if the community, this is a problem that's deeply impacting these communities. And if you want to solve both sides of the problem, the conservation of mountain gorillas and the way of life of the local community and their security, then they need to be part of the decision making. So long story short, that took another, let's say year to really kind of get people to recognize this wasn't about blame. It wasn't about imposing solutions. It's really about the fact that when you have the diverse people who are impacted by the issue, if you have them at the proverbial table, they will actually make better decisions, and you use that process to reconcile some of those deeper rooted conflicts. That they will actually make more sophisticated, better decisions, and those decisions are more likely to stick. Because if people own those decisions, if all the diverse actors at the table own those decisions, then they're going to, if you own something, you're going to defend it. If it's imposed on you, human reaction by any of us would be to react against it or retaliate.
Yeah, or to be resentful, so, I would think, yeah.
Right. Yeah, and, there's a lot of interesting research on anger. People can be angry about a decision, right? They don't like the result of that decision, and that will make people angry, right? Sure, any of us would be angry if we don't like a decision.
Right.
But people don't move toward revenge anger or retaliatory anger unless they don't like the process. If they feel that process is not fair, not legitimate, not inclusive, then that moves people toward revenge anger, which is anger is not a bad thing, right? Anger can be super constructive and can be an opportunity, and conflict, right, can be an opportunity to bring people together, but it becomes destructive when the process is not seen as fair, legitimate, inclusive, et cetera.
Yeah.
So that is basically I kind of happily fell into this role, and it worked great. Like there were some unintended, like some shortfalls with that, which I'm happy to talk about as well.
Yeah.
But it brought everybody together, and what it did is it got everybody. They came up with solutions that even through invasion by the Interahamwe, that they killed my counterpart. Like lots of violent conflict, constant change of staff over the years. People who were part of the process who died. It has a very high AIDS rate in that area. Because even through all that instability, what they put in place through that process stuck, and it's still going today. I'll tell you, the downside is that after that worked, right, I ended up bringing the 3 countries together that had mountain gorillas, and it was the first time they had all come together to look at this issue. Why are we having conflict here? Why are we not having it here? And kind of do that comparative analysis together with, whether it's high-level government officials, community members, conservation, development side, et cetera.
Yeah.
And but what didn't work, I'll say it didn't work, is so after this, everybody was like, wow, this is great. And they said, hey, can you put together a plan to, because we just kind of got to start on that. So a way to prevent or respond to that immediate crisis where mountain gorillas come out of the park. And that was put in place with a really good process that reconciled relationships and had a more sophisticated solution. That stuck. Then they said, hey, will you put together a more comprehensive plan to look at what else we can do to prevent this? And what I didn't do at that time, I was just a mere young thing, but I didn't know enough. And to me, what was implicit in doing good business, good conservation business, was that you focus on the process and relationships in order to get to good solutions. And so because these people had all been part of this process, I made an erroneous assumption that the process and the relationship building elements would carry forward because, that's how we got to that's how we got to this place where everybody felt really good about the results. So I focused in my, I went and looked at human-wildlife conflict all over the world and came up with a comprehensive plan that would, for this area. But I focused on the substance. And in that, I didn't, and it might not have made a big difference, big deal either way anyway. I could have said, hey, make sure you use a really good process. It's inclusive. It's not imposed. I could have said all that and it might have been ignored, but I didn't say it. And so the effort to then implement the rest of the plan that I put in place was met with a lot of unintended negative consequences and sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back or 3 steps back over the years. Now I've heard it's not as bad as it was at the peak, when it was bad. But before this process went place, hey, you don't want to get on audio recording. So
it's all happening live.
Right, but that was a really big lesson learned for me, that what I considered, just what to me was intuitively just good business needed to that piece needed to be more explicit, the process and relationship piece. And then I went on and I did other work, like in Bhutan on tigers and this other stuff. And what I realized was I could do it, but I couldn't actually share it. And I'm a very sharing person, so when people would be like, wow, that was great, how did you do that? And I'd be like, I don't know, and just like flying by the seat of my pants. So then I went and found somebody so I was looking for a process, I was looking for an approach that matched what I thought was really important for fish, wildlife, natural resource conflicts. And conflict resolution didn't didn't match what I needed. Like I learned about that in grad school, and I was kind of like, yeah, it just doesn't fly. If you're going to, and there's a lot of different conflict resolution approaches and stuff like that. So, but just for, just to generalize here when I say conflict resolution, I'm talking about more of an interest-based negotiation, alternative dispute resolution, kind of the popular, more mainstream versions of addressing conflict. Those are great if you're trying to, you're negotiating to buy a car. At the end of the day, you may hate the car dealer and the car dealer may hate you, but if you get your car and they get their money, great, you're done, right?
Right.
And you never have to see them again. But in these fish, wildlife, natural resource, conservation, and management contexts, these people and these institutions and these groups, they're working together or working against one another continuously through time, right? Those institutions, whether it's government or a nonprofit or a community, a local community, those communities and groups are, they're going through time continually working on something. So, even when I went into the wolf case in Washington State,
right.
They were still talking about the spotted owl conflict from, 20, 30 years ago, right? Because that history of unresolved disputes, because the processes didn't feel fair to people, the issue, the grievances and the frustrations and the anger from that time then spills over into the next conflict coming up.
Right.
So anyway, so I learned from people in the conflict transformation field, and I was like, okay, this is a much better match to what we need to do, like what's the reality on the ground and what's really needed. And so we adapted conflict transformation for conservation. So we use an approach called conservation conflict transformation, which is adapted for these kinds of natural resource conflicts. And it's essentially the approach is, you can tell that I don't talk in sound bites, by the way.
No, it's fine. I mean, you could probably tell. I just like to listen. So, I mean, I have questions I'm going to ask you, but who better than you to tell me about what you do?
And so I'm just going to babble and I'll shut up at some point. Anyway, I'll take that one off the record. So our approach is really, you can think of it, we go deep, we go wide, and we go long. And so by go deep, I mean, we seek to reconcile that us versus them conflict, which can also sometimes be an us versus us conflict. So it's not, there's always the presenting issue, right? The dispute, that's the sort of material, tangible, physical issue that people are talking about. But underneath that, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, like that's like from, and I figured maybe the conversation will go this way where like, I'm trying to connect two dots and then maybe somewhere in the middle, or maybe like by the time we're wrapping up, it's like, oh, okay, well, this is actually where we overlap. Like, because I feel like with the sort of stuff I write about and what I read about that's written about it in general, and we could just sort of brush it like under a bigger umbrella, although it's still nebulous, of like internet culture, which is a side topic. I just want to, hear how much that's on your radar, what's on your radar from that. I feel like what I'm hearing from you is a lot of, I don't know if this actually gets deployed when you're on the, boots on the ground or whatever, when you're talking to two or more different camps. Is that you recognize that issues don't exist in a vacuum. But I feel like often when I read about things that are written online or internet culture problems or a particular subculture is causing a lot of problems, it seems like there's not even, I wouldn't even say that there's short-term memory. It just seems like many times issues are, this was caused from something that happened in March. And it's like, there's no digging in deeper. There's no greater context. And a lot of journalists and writers I know, their attitude is like, well, that's kind of the purview of academia. That's not really our job to to like help people understand their issues. I'm not sure I agree with that.
Yeah, and I think what's lacking in that space is an opportunity to humanize people, to humanize one to the other. I had a hunter that I was working with who was very active in his hunting community. He previously, did not have anything good to say about environmentalists. He joined this process in Washington and met the environmentalists and stuff, and was like, oh my God, these are great people. Like, these are really, really great people. And this man had and has a lot of social courage. Like, people would say, dehumanizing things in, internet forums and that kind of thing. And he was like, you know what? You come meet them, because you don't know, and so he would speak up, and he had the courage to say, no, you're wrong. Even though this was his group, he had the courage to say, no, you're wrong. Like, I know these people, and I work with these people, and they are trustworthy. And, he took some heat for that, I think, initially, because that's not, that isn't the norm. But again, that's why I say this. He has an enormous amount of social courage, because it does take courage to stand up and especially go against your own tribe, to say, hey, this isn't the reality of, and meet the people. Right. And so he called it liquid digital courage or something, that people just, kind of get behind that computer. And it happens on all sides.
I was just gonna say, I interviewed somebody earlier this week, also for this, and I don't know about the phrasing, although I think the intent of the statement is true, where they said, like, oh, well, negativity is toxic, but positivity is toxic as well. I don't know that I would characterize positivity as toxic. I think
How did they mean it was toxic?
I think they mean that it's contagious is more what they meant.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Because I think positivity is a good thing, but that's just my opinion.
Right. It is. I mean, this is the thing, is people say, oh, well, if we all meet and we humanize and we empathize with the other, maybe we're going to oh God, we're going to compromise. Yeah. It's kind of like, at some point, there's always going to be a compromise at some point, and whether that looks like these sort of dramatic pendulum swings that we see, where it's like these very one-sided wins, where like, yay, I win, I beat the other side. But the reality is, all that does is provide fuel for the other side to fight back and win next time. And whether you're talking about fish, wildlife, natural resources, or you're talking about these communities or industries, they all need the stability and the vitality and the ability to thrive long term. And so, that's the other thing with these other approaches are much more, so my car dealer analogy, it's very short term, and it doesn't focus on the relationships and those processes that can be resilient, right? So bad things are going to happen. It is a given in life. And so this approach, this CCT, Conservation Conflict Transformation approach, is designed to engage with these systems and create that, we embed the capacity in that system and create that resilience over time, so that when bad things happen, right, and that takes us to the, WSJ article, is it was a rough grazing season, right? You had wolves die, you had cows die, that's going to frustrate people and it's going to create tension. But immediately, when these things started happening, people started calling one another, whether it was government to citizen, whether it was urban to rural or rural to urban, whatever it was, they started calling each other and they said, hey, let's figure this out together. This is a problem. We're not happy. How do we work on this together? And that is the resilience that we're looking for. It's not that tensions aren't going to get high. It's not that people aren't going to be frustrated. That would be like saying, oh, you're going to have a marriage, and the marriage is a failure if you and your spouse don't agree on everything all the time and don't have miscommunication or conflict, right? Like, it's a ridiculous notion to think that any relationship isn't going to have tension. It isn't going to have frustration, misunderstanding, all kinds of stuff that put stressors. But if they can communicate, and their motivation is to come back together and say, hey, let's work this out, that's when you have a strong, resilient relationship. So, and back to your sort of internet media, social media.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, it is a challenge. It is and I should say it's also an opportunity because there are ways to connect over the internet that you wouldn't have in person, right? But it is the sort of Achilles heel of it is that it is very it is an easy opportunity to dehumanize and to blame or whatever the other, right?
Yeah.
But there are examples where people have used social media, internet forums, etc., to bridge divides. And so I mentioned one with this hunter who, put he was willing to have that courage to stand up in his community. There was another young woman that I worked with who was a teenager at the time who had started a website about kids and wolves. And adults would come on this website and they would, argue against wolves. And she, very, wise young woman would listen, and she would not get into the blame game or anything, but she would engage them in conversation, and she had a lot of conversations through her forum where people changed their mind, they softened their tone, they were willing to listen, they were willing to explore facts or whatever. And then I remember years ago learning about some effort, I think it was in Lebanon, and it was because the media can sometimes be quite tempted to paint things in that us versus them light.
Right.
That it was journalists who came together and said, okay, we are not going to be part of the destructive conflict. We are going to report accurately, but in a way that's not being divisive, that we're not adding to that divisive conflict. And so I do think social media and the internet can be a force for good.
Right.
I think the reality is it's very easy for people to be angry and not take the 10 minutes of or the 5 deep breaths or whatever, and they do it, and it really hurts people's feelings. Like when I went out, particularly in rural communities, when I would meet with these communities, individuals in the communities, they would have a printout of an article that appeared in the paper and the comment section underneath, which had people saying incredibly hostile and violent and dehumanizing things toward them as a whole, right? And it hurts. It really hurts. And they're like, how are we supposed to, because they knew why I was there. Yeah. I'm a third-party neutral trying to bring people together. And they're like, how are we supposed to work with these people? How are we supposed to talk to these people if they're saying, hey, take your gun and shoot yourself? Like how are we supposed to sit down with them?
Right.
And that's the thing, the reason why I think more opportunities for face-to-face and more humanizing needs to occur. But, and I think you can do humanizing over the internet.
Right.
I think it's a little more of a challenge.
Right.
But that's why that needs to occur, because otherwise it takes the worst, like the most destructive actors on each side, and they become representative of the whole. Right? Right.
I mean, I always think of that because I think that's true in the video game world and sometimes the way they're portrayed, which is that I don't think that there is a subculture or group around or that's ever been around that doesn't or hasn't felt marginalized in some way. And I don't think there has ever been a group or is a group where they don't want to be represented or thought of exclusively by like their worst actors, although
right.
It does seem to be there is a pattern of that, and I do think that is true of the video game space. And I always go back and forth on like, well, is that fair? Who can you communicate? Who can you just even like that's sort of the thing with this project is like, you know, it's two people talking. It shouldn't be that unusual. But
Right.
it does seem very alien to this group that this project is geared towards. But you know, like the Wall Street Journal article, like it describes you, somebody described you as like putting a metal detector at the door and stopping grenades from being rolled in, and that you gave them the tools for talking to each other. So, I mean, how heated can these conflicts get that you intervene on? I mean, are people literally bringing grenades?
No. And I will say that the grenade throwing, the verbal grenade throwing, they talked about, that all happened before I ever came in.
Sure.
I never saw anybody throw a grenade at anybody. And the reason why is because from the very beginning, I am designing a process that moves people toward mutual understanding for, you know, giving each other that dignity and respect that every individual on every side needs. And so the process is designed to get at that common ground, and it's designed to build on that. And so from so yes, I heard those stories before about the grenade throwing, but I never see it because of how you design that process.
So yeah, I mean,
and,
so
and
what?
The problem is
I was just gonna ask, like, yeah, what is your methodology? Like, how do you get to, you know, get people to thaw and see eye to eye?
Well, you're not designing it. I mean, every process is context specific. So,
sure.
You know, there is no like, here's step 1, step 2, step 3. But what I will say is that you don't design it to be a competition, right? Most processes are designed to be competitive, to outvote the other, to, you know, whatever it is, use whatever tools in the toolbox as a weapon. And a process has to be very explicitly designed to not be that, to be genuinely collaborative and genuinely find and build on that common ground. And it always exists. Even in the most contentious of issues, it always exists. The other thing is I involve the people who are impacted by the conflict. I involve them in the design of whatever that process or processes are. And that's really important, too, because they know better than I do what is the language of war in their context. They know better than I do what their needs and concerns and core values are. And so it's not me parachuting in with, you know, a flip chart marker and an agenda and slapping it down. I draw from the wisdom, experience, and intelligence in that room. And when you do that and you design the process specifically to be about that coming together, about reconciling the relationship, the identity conflict, that us versus them, if you design it for that, then people are able to have much more honest conversation in a very constructive way. And constructive doesn't mean that people don't get upset or they're not hurt or angry, but they can talk about it in a way that allows them to really be heard and allows them to really deeply, each side or each individual to deeply understand where the other is coming from. So I think that's the difference in our methodologies. We're designing it to reconcile that us versus them conflict, designing it with the people who are impacted by that conflict, because they're the ones that have the wisdom. And it's about, you know, focusing, having a process that truly is fair, inclusive, and legitimate for them, right? And if they're part of the design of it, then it is like they know what a fair, inclusive, legitimate process looks like, right? More than anybody.
Yeah.
So I think so. Those are some elements of it, but yeah, it is about that. It is, I think, about it's the process that allows the relationship. So you think about anybody making a decision, right? So most processes are designed toward the problem, right? You're like, okay, here's the problem, and what does that do? That just divides the room because everybody sees a different way of solving the problem, and so you kind of like people design a process toward a problem, and they don't engage in the complexity of the issues, both from a socially complex and culturally and emotionally complex, as well as, these fish, wildlife, natural resource conflicts are very complex. And, people who don't engage with that complexity, they can make it look in the media or on the internet like it's a very simplistic issue, right? It's, don't kill any wolves, kill all the wolves, right?
Yeah.
Take the cattle off, whatever that issue is, they can make it. But the complexity of that, they are not engaging in really understanding the complexity and the unintended negative consequences that can come from, like, if you were to, people say, okay, you can't have any, I won't even go into that. But anyway, the point is if people oversimplify the problem too soon, and then they come up with this simplistic solution, and it's easy to do that when you hang out in your own bubble. And right, because and you can look in any field, whether it's peace building or whether it's business, and it is always the process, how that process is designed, and to bring in those diversity of voices that make the best decisions or solutions in the end.
I'm just curious, like, when you are sitting down to, as a neutral third party, I don't even know if there is a typical, but I'm wondering what the initial response is to once you get both sides to sit down. Is there a typical response, or do you notice there are typical tendencies in people's attitudes or the things they say, or?
I think people are surprised that and this is sort of an initial impression that people have is like, oh God, this is going to be some touchy-feely kumbaya crap,
yeah.
Right? So I think one surprise is, oh, this is really productive. Like,
yeah,
and productive for me. This is like people are often surprised by that, and so often the initial like, oh God, we don't want to do the kumbaya, sit around and roast marshmallows crap, and it's not that, right? It is very, it is designed to be very productive. I wonder, do you see, like, because you have a physical component to this, whereas the stuff that I am looking at is almost exclusively digital. Do people's demeanors change? Do you notice, like, their body language dramatically?
Change? Yeah, like how so?
Dramatically.
How so?
Back before I came into the Washington case, as an example, one of the processes that I, helped guide was this Wolf Advisory Group, and that had been going on for 3 years, and those people couldn't talk to each other beforehand, and they would, either yell at each other or they'd walk out of the room, and or just not speak to one another.
Yeah.
They'd sit there. This is what they were telling me because I didn't see it.
Sure.
But their arms crossed, et cetera. And the first, and people would say, that they can't talk to the other side. Like, they're impossible. They're, irrational, like whatever the terms might be. And the first day of the first meeting where I brought these people together under a different kind of process, I had a rancher and a wolf advocate sitting next to each other who for 3 years couldn't talk to each other. And they kept talking and giggling with each other the whole time, right? And then laughing because they were getting in trouble. It became a joke, right? Like, we couldn't talk to they were saying we couldn't talk to each other for 3 years, and now we keep having these sidebar conversations and laughing, and we're getting in trouble with you, because I'm like, hey, no sidebar conversations.
Right.
So people lose their defensiveness. They become more receptive to, right? So their body language, their tone, and what they're saying and how they're saying it is really dramatically changes from the get-go. So it is, other people notice it. So people might have, before they've experienced it, they may have this like, oh God, this isn't going to work because our conflict is too intractable.
Yeah.
Or I don't want to sit around and talk about feelings all day. But then they're, very, very quickly, they are shocked to see that they're actually sitting in a room with human beings who have feelings and have hurt and anger and frustration, and they're able to listen to them and they're able to be heard.
Yeah.
So it ends up being very, motivating and galvanizing. Is like, okay, good. How soon are we going to meet again? Because we want to work together. So that's cool. I had one guy once, this was years ago, who the first time he walked in the room, he said, I don't want to be here. My boss made me come, and I don't like talking about feelings. And then he sits down. And I was like, great, okay, good. And he ended up being a huge champion and still is for both this approach and for working with, his others that previously had been he actually did talk about his feelings. I think it's often people go in and they're going in and what looks like an attack is really, people are scared, right? I mean,
yeah.
that attack and defensiveness is a fear. And I think, so back to your internet stuff, I think if there was a way for people to make sense of what they're hearing and be able to understand that what looks like aggression is really fear and pain inverted, right? It's like,
yeah.
And I think if they can understand that, then I think we can, person to person, have more compassion for the other.
Well, yeah, like you say, like the attitude, which I think is a common one of, I don't want to sit around and talk about my feelings all day. Like, I feel like that's really kind of code for, I don't want to change my mind or think about why my thoughts are what they are. And I don't I wonder, like you mentioned, a bunch of conflicts all over the world, or a couple. And I know that's like, we don't have to get into like a bunch of politics stuff, but I've like observed that, over the decades in debates, that somehow people changing their mind about an issue equals like weakness of character, or that they would be a bad leader for some reason. Is your feeling like, is that a distinctly American trait? That's sort of like, I don't know, like it's more pronounced than stubbornness, because it's stubbornness and like just damn all consequences because my mind is made up. I don't think that's uniquely American, but yeah.
So it's not uniquely American.
Yeah.
And here's the thing: is what looks like stubbornness, resistance, putting up walls, is a fear that people are going to be pushed to have to change their core values, change their identity. Because again, a lot of processes are they can be perceived or felt to be your values or your beliefs, your way of life is wrong. And
right.
So again, it's designed for this, it's my way or the highway. And all that does is make the other person say, well, hell no, I'm not going to change, right? Because none of us want to change our core values. So it's about holding those core values, holding that way of life and identity, and allowing those and legitimizing and recognizing the importance of those values as they are, and then figuring out a way to come up with shared problem solving. Do you get the distinction there?
Yeah, I do.
As opposed to you need to change your core values in order to change your behavior. And again, I'm not saying people do that. It's not even the intention. Sometimes it's the intention, but it's not always the intention. But if the design of the process triggers that, nobody wants to change their core values. And if the design of the process makes a person or a group feel that who they are is bad, wrong, and fundamentally needs to change, then yeah, you're not going to get anywhere. And that isn't an American thing. That's a human thing, right?
Yeah.
We will protect, and that's the thing with identity conflict is if our identity is threatened, we're going to fight. And we will go so far as to shoot ourselves in the foot if it means a chance of harming the other, right? It becomes, because you feel like you're like someone's trying to annihilate you.
Yeah.
Right? Even in non-classic definition of genocide contexts, I hear people talk about the social conflict around fish and wildlife issues as a kind of genocide, because it feels like the other side is trying to annihilate an entire way of life, whether that's environmentalists or ranchers or hunters or indigenous groups or industry, or government, whatever it is, right? And nobody, that doesn't make people want to be vulnerable, right? So who's going to talk about their feelings? Who's going to express their deep concerns and needs if they feel like that's only going to be used against them, right? And again, it's a process thing. If it's set up like that, and again, it's not intentionally. I don't think people mostly want to set it up that way, but we have these sort of de facto ways of engaging in negotiation or, debate or whatever it is that is, I'm right, you're wrong. And right. I do think, so I think it's a global issue. I don't think the U.S. is unique in that regard. I will say that I think there is a heightened sense of moral judgment in the U.S. and other places now, right? So
I've seen it written. I've read somewhere like an op-ed where I think they summed it up very nicely. Where more like at this point in history in the U.S., like more is allowed than ever before, but less is tolerated than ever before.
Yeah. And there is a strong sense. 40 years ago, it wasn't a big deal if you were a Republican or Democrat, right? It was just like sort of like a different approach to how we govern, and right. Like that's cool. And it wasn't a violation of a social norm to be friends with the other.
That's right.
We've moved to a place in society where you work with the other, you're friends with the other, you God forbid, collaborate or compromise with the other, and that then you are now you're betraying your side, you're a sellout, you're not as morally pure as the rest of us. And I think that misperception of moral superiority and moral purity is, people think that that's going to get them further faster, and all it does is create massive unintended consequences and massive resistance to change. And it doesn't allow you, but you're looking at sort of good versus evil, and you see the world that way, then it's much easier to it's much easier to dehumanize or punish or impose or disregard that which you consider evil, because then you dehumanize them and they're no longer human beings, and so you don't really care about them. Right?
Yeah.
So I think that is going on. And I think what happens is that as those social norms get created, then, people don't want to violate social norms. So they kind of, try to stay within the bounds of those. And the more people try to stay within the bounds of these social norms that we can't talk to the other side, the more extreme they become.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, I think these things are so universal to the extent that, it almost doesn't even matter that my line of inquiry, the thing I keep going back to, is video games, because I think for some people that might be revelatory. Oh, there were fights on the internet, in your neck of the woods among hunters. Like there's fighting in like knitting forums online. Like there's fighting everywhere online because it's people.
Yep.
But I do wonder, this is really front of mind for me because this is sort of one of the through lines of like a book I just spent the last year writing and I'd be curious to hear your perspective on it. Is does it feel like something is missing when it comes to the tools we have available to communicate with each other online? Like, because I hear a lot of people say like, oh, well, that's just how Facebook is designed. Like they want us to fight with each other. I'm not sure who they is. But does it feel like there are pathways missing when we go to email each other or tweet at each other that it actually makes it more difficult in some way to be compassionate?
Yeah, I think there is a reward system, right? So, like in media, they say if it bleeds, it leads, right?
Yeah, I want to ask about that next.
Yeah, and negative news is stickier, for sure. So I think it takes a greater intentionality to ensure that dialogue is constructive on the internet, right? And it has to be, and the more diffuse the connection, right? The fact that they can't see each other, they can't talk, they're not in a process that's designed to bring them together. I think you have to create some version of that process and very explicit for how you bring people together on the internet, in these forums, et cetera. And then there has to, I also think there has to be, so I think there are explicit actions you could take. And I think if you leave it as a free-for-all, you can move toward, especially in this day and age, I think you can move toward that, more destructive dialogue. It's not even dialogue, right? It's destructive yelling at each other.
Right.
But so I think you have to be more intentional and more explicit about what those rules of engagement are and how people can contribute on that forum. And I do think it's doable. I don't know that it's been, the nut has been cracked on a massive level here.
No.
But then the other thing is the rules of engagement. It's not about, I think it has to be about if you want to engage on this, it's a voluntary compliance thing, but there's consequences for not complying with it. And then I think it has to be self-police, self-enforced, right? Is that, if my side is saying, X, I need to say, hey, maybe we want to change that. And I think what you might mean is, and say it reframe it in a way that's more constructive.
Yeah.
But I think we have to hold, I think the strongest way to foster that, have some kind of explicit process or explicit rules of engagement, again, in a, I don't know, everyone said that, but is then it has to be kind of, it has to have an element of being self-enforced.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I was reading these articles on civility, and it was, right, so people are saying, we should bring back civility, right, whether that's on the internet or, in whatever form. And then there was I found it fascinating, the sort of different perceptions of what civility means, because there are communities, let's just take our country for a moment.
Sure.
Where civility has meant people can't be angry about injustices to their community. And to me, true civility is about being authentic and telling your truth, and you can be angry and you can be frustrated and you can speak to those injustices. It's not about this superficial politeness and sweeping stuff under the rug, because again, that's not going to get anybody anywhere. It's about bringing your authentic self, and sometimes your authentic self is a little messy. right? I mean, you're mad, like, right? Yeah, I know. Yeah. Who among us doesn't have a messy, authentic self, right? I mean, but to me, the very definition of civility isn't about some kind of superficial politeness. I think that's kind of the wrong way around. I think it's about being able to have that authentic conversation, and it can be messy, but each side knows that and genuinely feels the good intent, right? And you can tell the difference. I mean, for me, I can tell the difference when someone is saying something kind of harsh or, they're expressing an anger, but they're doing it with the goal of having the other understand so they can find a path forward together. Yeah. Or when they're doing it just to be an obstructionist, right? And those are very different expressions of anger.
Or like maliciously compliant or something. Or it's funny because I was going to say, like, even if someone is polite on the internet, I mean, I don't know if you've seen this. I feel like, I just feel like I never see the phrase online like, oh, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Like, I feel like if someone is polite online, the response very well could be, well, why are you making fun of me? Or it would start some stuff. I don't know. I mean, like, that was sort of one of the other bigger questions I had, and the initial questions I had when I read that piece. You talked about it a little bit. It's just, I wonder, I know it's not a monolith, but like, what can media do to help with these kinds of entrenched frictions? Because a lot of my non-journalist friends and many of my journalist friends, they feel that media often just arms people with pitchforks and torches every minute of every day.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is where I think...
I'm not asking how do we solve this. I'm just saying how can we make it better.
Right, and I think this is where journalists, they need to have the social courage to say, you know what, I might get more hits on this story if I really draw out the negative and the us versus them. But that they're going to advocate for a more realistic story, where you're not intentionally trying to single out the most oppositional people on each side, but you are capturing the diversity of voices on each side, as opposed to just going for the most inflammatory. You know what I mean?
It's always weird it's always weird because I felt like growing up, I did not go to journalism school. Sorry for the lingo.
Sorry.
I'm using lingo for school I didn't even go to. I don't know what that's about. I feel like that was sort of the conventional wisdom was, maybe 15 years ago, you go to write a story, well, you quote an expert on one side, and then you got to go quote an expert on the other side, and you have to quote these two extremes. And I always felt like, well, don't they kind of cancel each other out? Like, what are we even really saying by just, not just, but I mean, that's people's perception of neutrality. I'm not sure what that is. I feel like that just confuses people more.
Well, I'm not suggesting that journalism needs to be neutral. I'm suggesting that if you have a conflict where, maybe the conflict started where people were all on one side or all on the other. And, you could, a lot of my work, that's where it starts. And then you build this really wonderful, complex, large middle ground. But then you have journalists who are working harder and harder to get the extreme voices, right? And to document the extremes on either side, when those have gotten very, very small, and then the majority middle, right? That beautiful middle ground where people are working together and being resilient and, being respectful of each other and really digging into the complexity of those issues. If that's being ignored, then you're not telling an accurate story. You were trying to tell a divisive story where you're saying, let me dig further and further and further or let me rely on this one person who I know will always say something provocative and polarizing,
right.
and then I'm going to get the other side.
Right.
And so I think that's kind of what's happened. I have had, I can remember a conversation where I had a conversation with a rancher, and I was saying, I said something, and it was about a media thing, and he said, journalists don't want to hear from the majority of us who, we want to raise our livestock. We have no interest in killing wolves. That's the majority of us, is we want to just figure out how do we address this problem in a way that works for us and works for society. But we don't get the call, right? And I think people who become part, who their issues become part of a news story, they know that, right? They know that they no longer get calls because they're not going to say something that fits into a pre-prescribed storyline of look at this, but the conflict is super destructive. And so I think that takes integrity, and I think it takes courage on the part of the journalist to not just try to create something that's bleeding so that it gets the readership, but that tries to tell a more accurate story. We had a very funny situation where we had a journalist who was coming to these wolf advisory group meetings, and at one point, and the people were like, why isn't this person reporting accurately what happened? Like, we were in the room, and that's not what was being reported, was not in the room. And so one of the government guys went up to him and said, hey, like, why aren't you reporting accurately? And he's like, well, nobody will read it. And
at least he admitted it, I suppose.
He's like, right? He's like, if this is wolves, right? It's got to be divisive. And so this government guy was just like, he's like, yeah, but think about how much readership you would get if you told a story that's never been told about people actually collaborating and trying to solve each other's problems. Like, that would be newsworthy, right?
Yeah.
And, and this guy laughed, right? I mean, he laughed, and, and I'm not blaming him. Like, he may be getting pressure to tell one side of to tell the story in some way. I think the other issue too is that I think we've moved, and this gets to that complexity simplicity thing, where the complex story, we've got what is it like now, an 8-second attention span, and so there's definite societal pressure for telling the shorter, simple story. And so I think it's a vicious cycle, right? Like, is that society doesn't want to hear the complex story because that takes too long. And it doesn't fit. It's more, the war, peace, black, white thinking is much, it's much more easily digestible than, hey, this is a really complex issue. Let me tell you about it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then because people don't want it, they're not, whatever it is, if it's the media or Twitter or, whatever it is trying to meet the needs of its audience. And by meeting the needs of its audience, it's telling a shorter, simpler, more superficial story. And then it further, right? It's like, if you think about it, it's like a muscle, right? It's a muscle that's not being worked in society to grapple with complexity. And certainly in my work, and if you're dealing with fish, wildlife, natural resource issues, it's always complex. Like, it isn't a simple story. And if you get a simple story, you should question that, right? Because there's more going on there.
I just love the phrase complex middle ground. That actually feels like the complete version of that phrase, middle ground. So, I think I got like one or two more questions for you. And again, these were sort of my gut reaction ones when I read that article about what you do. Is I don't even know if something like this is possible, because I don't think we can really relegate like provocations or ways that this kind of thinking is reinforced or encouraged. Like, I don't think it's strictly media. I don't think it's strictly social media. I don't think it's strictly Facebook. But I just like, I read about your organization. I was just wondering, like, boy, does there need to be an organization like yours for civilians, for just people who go online? Like I think about that, and then I think, well, don't we have some sort of personal responsibility for, like, maybe we aren't willing to acknowledge it yet, but like, it's a choice that we're making to go off not even half cocked. It's maybe quarter cocked, which is a weird choice of words, but I don't know. I mean, so if it's not some group like that, I mean, what do you think it will take for us to acknowledge that, you know, we were in the driver's seat on this? Like, we actually, we drove ourselves here. Yeah. I think that's a great comment/question.
So one of the things that we do, it's a core tenet of our work, is that we build capacity of the people who are involved in the conflict, and we embed that capacity in that, you know, sector of society that we're working in. And we do that because people have to solve their own problems, right? Like, we do not want to be parachuting in, fixing something and then leaving because it'll fall apart. And, you know, this is their world, right? They're the ones that have a stake in this, not us. So capacity building is always a huge part of what we do. And I completely agree with you that we all have a personal responsibility and choice every single day of how we're going to interact. And I think, and we're also part of our society and our culture. You know, I mean, the term peace building isn't even in the dictionary, but we use 1,000 words for war. Yeah. Right. Like,
well, I noticed that your organization, or at least on your LinkedIn, it seems that your organization changed its name from having conflict collaboration in the name to peace building in the name instead.
Yeah. And that was the old name it was really a placeholder for when we launched.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of this, I had gotten this international mandate. I brought people from all over the world and said, hey, what does our field need? Or what does this field need? And you know, that was how the organization was born. And they said, hey, we want you to lead it. And then, and so it sort of started with that name as a placeholder. And then as we were launching the organization, I was kind of like, okay, well, what do you guys want to call the name? And they're like, oh, this is kind of stuck. Like, everybody knows what this is.
Yeah.
But as we continued in our work, the name doesn't really convey what we do. So when people hear human-wildlife conflict, they think, oh, you know, how are we going to build a fence or, you know, put up, you know, beehives to keep out elephants or whatever. So they think tactical. And what we're doing is really the process and relationship piece. We don't get involved in the substance. So we finally got around to changing our name to what was a better match for actually what we do.
Yeah, I mean, I just figured, you know, even as it connects to like this personal responsibility thing we're talking about, like maybe it's counterproductive to think of things in terms of conflict because it entrenches that thinking, and then it like starts to permeate in our DNA or something, where it's like we can't stop thinking about it as a problem instead of like, well, how do we come together, you know?
Well, so I don't think there's anything wrong with saying conflict.
Yeah.
Because conflict is inherent in human communities. Like, you don't have a relationship with anybody, even yourself, right? Where there isn't conflict.
Yeah, that's true.
And conflict isn't an isolated incident. It's part of society's continual progression. And so conflict can be, you know, it can be a great opportunity for positive change. And that's, in fact, the conflict transformation approach is taking the energy from that destructive conflict and transforming it or changing it into that constructive opportunity for change. So we look at conflict, we're kind of like, great, there's a conflict going on. That's an opportunity, right? Because people, even if it looks kind of scary on the surface, that actually brings people together, right? And sometimes it brings people together initially in a destructive way, but you can use that energy to move people toward constructive. if there is no conflict, you don't really have an opportunity. So I don't think of conflict as a bad thing at all. And not just because, it's my work, but I mean, it really is, I had a personal conflict the other day, and it was just this wonderful, that conversation about that conflict was a wonderful opportunity for mutual learning, for mutual growth, for connecting and advancing the relationship. Like it was great. Like I was so excited that we had that opportunity, because if that conversation didn't happen, right? If that conflict didn't exist, we wouldn't have been able to advance our relationship. So, so I don't think there's anything. I think it's taking the what you're speaking to, and it certainly is a reality, is that we often have a fight, flight, or freeze reaction to conflict.
Yeah.
But I think if we can reorient ourselves to see conflict as something to be engaged with, then I think we will, then we can take some of the fear out of what it means to engage with conflict. But that does come back to what you were commenting on and asking about before, is about that capacity, right? Is individuals having both responsibility and capacity to address their own conflicts. And I've had people from the peace building field, who work globally say, hey, we need to do peace building in the United States, right? Like, people who are dealing with sort of, ISIS and all these other things are saying, whoa, we need to address stuff in the United States. And because we've actually been working in the United States on peace building longer, oddly, than anybody else has, because of, we work on wildlife issues. They're like, and because we've made progress on that, they're like, hey, anyway, the goal here is they want to involve us in how do we build mass capacity, and really start getting it down to individuals and individual communities so that they can actually lead positive change and facilitate those more constructive dialogues in whatever community they're in. So I think there is a role for that. And I do think it's more challenging in the, internet context, but I do think it's possible. I do think, but I agree with you that I think it has to be, you have to have individuals and institutions kind of step up and say, and take that leadership role, right? And have the courage to say, you know what? Even if we're moving in this more divisive, polarized, destructive conflict direction, we're going to take a stand and move things in a more positive direction. And we're going to take a leadership role in that. And that takes resources to make that happen. And unfortunately, resources are, very often moved toward the fight, not toward, because I think there's still a misperception that, if someone's fighting you, and it's irrational if you think about it, if someone's fighting you, you think you have to fight back, right? It's kind of like, hey, there's a war going on. If we add more war to this, we'll get peace, right? War plus war equals peace. And it doesn't. But it does, it's kind of like trying to stop, you can think of the vicious cycle of destructive conflict like a wheel turning, right? The energy that it takes to stop that wheel turning in one direction and then getting it started in the next, that's the toughest part. That takes the most resources, whether it's time, energy, funds, whatever, because it's the act of stopping the negative cycle and then reversing it and moving it into a virtuous cycle. So I don't know who's going to do that, but sign me up, because that, but it's tough, right? I mean, we, people, again, it gets to that, whether institutions, funders, donors, et cetera, they're looking for the quick fix. In our world, it's, hey, what do I do to save Cheetos? I'm going to put in this, livestock guardian dog, right? But what is actually going to build that receptivity and that tolerance, or whatever it might be? That's about the relationships and the process stuff. But that is not, and that's in any conflict or in any society, in order to get that society to move to more sort of high functioning quality society that comes together and solves its problems, people are looking for the quick fix, whether it's a, technological fix or a tangible fix. They're not recognizing that the inherent energy in that system could be harnessed better if people are brought together in more constructive ways. Does that make sense?
I think so.
I think so too, but
I think so too, but I think we started this conversation on a similar mindset.